Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Shields, and I'm the Vice Consul of Ireland covering the US Southeast. It is my great privilege in this role to take every opportunity I can to celebrate Ireland's artists. Ireland is a nation of storytellers. From our small island, our stories have travelled far and wide, carried by our diaspora and by the gifts of our writers, weaving connections for far beyond our shore. I am so pleased that those connections have brought us together in Charleston today. This session is on Long Island, a sequel to the award-winning novel Brooklyn, which reunites the reader with Eilis Lacey in the 1970s, as she returns to Ireland and tries to reconcile lost love with current reality. Eilis's story of leaving home for economic opportunity is familiar to Irish immigrants all over this country, not just in New York, Boston, Chicago, but right here in the city of Charleston. The influence of Irish immigration can be seen all over this city, from Sullivan's Island to the County Courthouse, Hibernian Hall, and the Irish Memorial at the end of Charlotte Street. Irish immigrants have many stories to tell, of family and friends left behind, of the road not taken, feelings of grief, abandonment, and loss, compounded by being a foreign person in a foreign land. This series explores these themes, and here to discuss them is author Colm Tóibín and broadcast journalist Bilal Qureshi. Colm has written 11 novels, including Long Island, The Magician, The Master, Brooklyn, The Testament of Mary and Nora Webster, as well as 2 story collections and several books of criticism. He's the Irene and Sidney B. Silverman Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University and has been named as the Laureate for Irish Fiction for 2022 to 2024 by the Arts Council of Ireland. He's been 3 times shortlisted for the Booker Prize and splits his time between Dublin and New York. And our interlocutor here today is Bilal Qureshi, who is a broadcaster, essayist, and critic. His radio interviews and reporting have aired across NPR's flagship news magazines, and he's a frequent contributor to NPR's Pop Culture Happy Hour. Bilal's writing and criticism is published in the New York Times, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and Newsweek. Born in Pakistan and grew up in Richmond, Virginia, he graduated with high distinction from the University of Virginia and earned an MS in broadcast journalism from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. And finally, before we begin, I would like to thank Wenda Harris and Jay Millard, Ann Mainers and Alex Papas, and Pat and Jim Marino, who are sponsors for this session. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Colm and Bilal.
Well, welcome to Charleston, and also welcome, in the sense that I can tell you that being here a few days, the anticipation, the excitement for your being here and for reading this book is palpable. You could feel the energy. People are walking around with copies of Long Island that they're trying to finish in time for today. So it's myself included. I was rereading it, so I have my copy as well. So thank you again for being here. I want to begin by asking you about, we just had the screening of Brooklyn right before in the same hall, and I saw that almost a decade ago when it came out. I wanted to begin by asking you about that book and, of course, the film. What was the experience like for you to have it, even beyond being such a huge success as a book, then becoming this it was a Best Picture nominee, it was this huge film as well. Can you talk a little bit about what you feel looking back on that particular book and the way it was received?
It was lucky, and then it took some decisions, because I think if the film had been made in Hollywood, it would have been a very different film, and if it had been made even by the BBC, it would have been a very different film. The producer was Finola Dwyer, whose parents went to New Zealand from Ireland in the same year as Saoirse goes to America, and she was living in London. She's New Zealand, but her parents are Irish. John Crowley, who directed the film, he was from Cork, living in London. Obviously, Saoirse Ronan was born in America, and her parents had taken her back to Ireland, and she was now, at the time of making the film, living in London on her own for the first time. And I come back and forth from the United States to Ireland. So all 4 of us had somehow got a stake in this story. It wasn't merely something that I wrote and we wanted to sort of get the best picture of. It was emotionally for us actually quite important. And the fact that it wasn't emotionally important for Nick Hornby, who wrote the screenplay, seemed to help in that he could take a very cold look at all our emotion and self-pity and try and do something with it. And the other thing that happened was, at the very beginning, we couldn't get the money, the producers couldn't get the money. So there were a few years when it looked as though it wasn't going to happen. And in those 3 years, Saoirse Ronan grew from being a sort of, I suppose, a child actress to being a young woman who had never played an Irish part. She'd done The Lovely Bones, she'd done Atonement, all those films, but she was looking for an Irish role, and here it was. And so the thing that happened to me, of course, was it was something else that began to really interest me, which was that Donald Gleeson, who plays the part of Jim in the film of Brooklyn, did something unusual for me and did something new. Because in a lot of cases, if you think, Irish film, Irish theatre, Irish novels are filled with Irish men who are really unstable, who are really untrustworthy, who are either very, very charming or brooding figures, or they're violent, they're coming towards you with a gun, or they're coming towards you with all their grievances. And they're bad fathers, they're bad lovers, they're bad husbands, they're just bad. And people put up with them. And we have that image of them from Eugene O'Neill, from those Eugene O'Neill plays, which are Irish-American plays, to a lot of contemporary film. And Donald Gleeson plays Jim as a decent, trustworthy, stable fellow who's not especially charming, who's not exceptional in any way, and he puts a glow, he gives this a glow, and it was that glow. I wrote to him at the time of the film saying, you've done something new with this. You've made an ordinary Irishman, which is the hardest thing to do. One is not going to burn your house down or shoot you, that figure he plays in that gave me, but it wasn't the idea as much as, I saw the film a good lot in the first year when it came out, and I became, whatever he did with the part of Jim interested me. And 10 years later, I began to see if there was something more I could do with that.
I wanted to mention about Brooklyn, at least, is that as someone who maybe is stating the obvious is not Irish and is not part of the Irish, gathering that we're also having here today, is that this book is beloved by so many people, and I happen to currently be living in West Africa, in Ghana, where at the English language bookshop in Accra, this is one of the main books still featured at the front of the store. And it's a book that people are reading all over the world as a great work of universal literature in a way. And I know that's always the goal of a novelist and of a book, is perhaps hopefully to be able to transcend, maybe not all novelists, but it seems to me like I'm curious if you, when this came out, how it also the way in which your work is super local and does feel very specific to a place that you are recreating. You're from Enniscorthy, and what it meant that it was something that many people could feel was their story. A lot of people read this book and are like, that's my story, even if they are from Ghana, for example.
I think if you set out to write a novel, which is going to be universal, and it's going to be in bookshops in Africa, and I think if you're Irish, I think you would get it so wrong. Everything you do would be to try and say, yeah, this is your story, my story, his story, her story. People say, it's nobody's story. So I honestly started, it was just a small thing. It wasn't even Irish. It wasn't even Wexford. It was Enniscorthy. And it was a very particular year, and it was an individual. And it struck me as being perhaps an Irish story in that it was a lot of families from the famine onwards, say from the 1840s onwards, lost someone to emigration, that people went to America or Australia or England. But I didn't see it the other way around. I didn't see it. I thought America, and there's so many cliches about America, but one of them is it's forward-looking. It only thinks about the future. It goes west, I think, actually, that's not entirely true. And I discovered that not when I was writing the book, but when the book came out, that a lot of Americans saw the story as somehow their story, but the story of their parents or grandparents, or even further back. And so gradually it took on that sort of aura of a book that could be about something that happened to you, but I never thought that when I was writing it. And if I had, I promise you, I would have destroyed the book. That it needed to keep that exact idea of particular houses, particular accents even, and particular shops. So I began very specifically, and through some accident, and I don't know what it's called, it took on a sort of different sort of life.
On now to talk about Long Island, which of course, I know this is the question that you always get asked, why a sequel? Do novels like this get sequels? But I wanted to ask you, when you mentioned the performance of Jim, the character of Jim in the film, that it sort of stayed with you. where the origins of the sequel come, because it's not so much a question of like the world was waiting for a sequel or you were wanting to write a sequel, but it is where the kind of the idea to revisit these characters began. Was it in that performance? Was it in sort of something that you saw? Because in the film they also go to Long Island they see the kind of open space that could become. Rewatching it made me realize the seeds of the new story are always there, but it wasn't a given when one read it and one saw the film that we would be returning to these people.
Sometime before I wrote Brooklyn, I was in the choir in the Catholic Church. I think on the Upper West Side of New York. I think 86th Street, and I would go to rehearsals, and I was no good, but no one really realised that, because if you're trying to sing as a baritone, you can always get the other baritone to do the work. And but one day we had to go into the parish house, into the parochial house, just to do some rehearsals in there. And I had realised that everything in that church, all the plaques, all the names were Irish names. Pray for the soul of Mary Ann Murphy, and it was all over the place. And I said to the priest, who was Hispanic, I said, where do the Irish go? Meaning it used to be an Irish church, there's no one Irish in the choir. There's no one Irish, it seemed to me, in the congregation. And he did that with his hand and went, oh yeah, they went out to the island, meaning they went out to Long Island. That's where people go, they go out to Long Island. I thought, just the way he did it, sort of the next stage. And so that was in my mind what he'd said. But also there's a moment when John Crowley was making the film. John Crowley was a great listener. And he said to me, is there anything in the book or in the script that I should really pay attention to as a critical moment, as something I could work from? And I said, yeah, it's when they go out to Long Island to look at the site. It's a greenfield site. And he starts to talk about what they're going to build there, the future. And so she's seeing suburban America, but it begins as a green field. And I said, that's an important moment because it's talking about some idea beyond them. And in the film, then I didn't know what he was going to do, but he brings the camera right back. So they become a speck in this great new world that's going to come into being. So that was in my mind. But I don't think novels should write sequels, and I think it's a shameful activity. And, I do. And you can just imagine if Moby Dick had a brother called John Dick, or something. This guy, stop it. Imagine if Madame Bovary, Monsieur Bovary, or Madame Bovary's older sister.
So you don't support literary multiverses.
Stop it. Yeah. Imagine with Ulysses, after one day, the 16th of June, 1904, and the next one would begin, Leopold Bloom woke up the following morning. And you realize, oh my God, it's another 600-700 pages. This one's going to be based on the Iliad. And you think, there's no future in this. This is not what should be happening. And a novel has its own shape. And when you come to the end of a novel, you should really, I think, feel whatever is happening here, the rhythms are being designed to bring the novel down, to move towards an ending. So how can I defend myself? Well, I can't really, is the first thing. And the second thing is, an idea came to me of that opening of Long Island. And normally I would put it away because it was just too strong, too melodramatic. And no one needs Irishmen shouting anymore. That time is over. Irishmen stopped shouting. And therefore, here was an Irishman shouting. And I would have normally put it away, but it just stayed with me that idea of two Irish people who don't know one another, confronting one another in this place, which is so far from Ireland. And also, what I've been doing over the previous decade, I've been teaching a seminar every year on the novel. On the Victorian novel, on the 19th century, on Jane Austen, on especially Thomas Hardy, Joseph Conrad, Edith Wharton, those sort of novels. And so I was filled with all the theories about how you start a novel. What does plot mean? What's a plot? And a plot is an action that requires or implies or allows consequences. So it's not that a plot needs an action. The action is just given. The consequences of the action become what's important. And those consequences must be plausible but not predictable. So you go, plausible, not predictable. So I had all these theories, and suddenly I realized, I could write a novel with a plot. And I haven't done it before, in which everything would be directed towards some ending. So there would be a dilemma. There would be a problem. There would be treachery. There would be lies. There would be who knows what, who doesn't know what. And so I would write a different sort of novel But that's just a way of me sort of cheaply defending myself against something that I'm generally opposed to, which is novelists writing sequels to their books.
I mean, you said something really, I think, about this book, is that while it is a sequel and it is Eilis and it is Jim and it is Enniscorthy, it's a very different experience reading this book than the first book. And a lot of it is, in fact, that, and again, we can't almost discuss so much of it, partly because the plot is so central to this book. Not that it isn't in the first, but I mean, there are these kind of like page-turner feelings, and you're really dealing with a domestic drama in a way, and yet it has a very plot kind of driven feeling, especially as we get to the last part of the book. You mentioned that the opening, and you had been sort of researching and studying that. I mean, it really flowed from that first scene. The whole rest of the story for you came out of that opening when Eilis opens the door, because it begins and it's off right away. I mean, we're into the kind of the narrative from the very beginning.
Part of it comes also from the experience of reading, and I don't just mean contemporary fiction. I mean, books in general. You start a novel and you think, I wish I knew before I start this where it's set, who is talking, when it is, and you go through 3 pages thinking, I still don't know who she is. And I thought, I'd love to do something about that. And some of it also came from teaching, where you think, you're reading someone's short story and you have to say by the end of the story, I have no idea where this was. Is this set in Philadelphia? Or is it set, like it really matters where something, in Ireland certainly, if it's set in Cork, it really matters, versus Dublin, say. So I thought, why don't you just, from the moment the book begins, make absolutely clear. I mean, I won't do this again. The next time I'll write an opaque opening. But I was conscious of trying to do something different than the books I had done before.
I mean, and maybe this is me projecting too, but I will say when I read the first novel and also when I saw the film, even though it was almost a decade ago, I did feel that this novel struck me as also a novel about middle age in a lot of ways, and a novel about, I think Eilis is, I mean, it's stating the obvious, but they're in their 40s, it's set in the 70s obviously, but in the beginning you have, in the first novel you have that romance of youth, and there is something about it that feels a little bit like, are you going to choose, Tony is as much a projection of Eilis as he is a reality. But here you have that, you're now in the cul-de-sac in Long Island, you're living with your in-laws, it's a little bit like, maybe I should have done this and not that. I mean, there's more of that sort of, and I may be in that stage myself, maybe questioning some of those choices. So I'm curious to ask you about this did you think of it as a middle-aged novel, not to, because it does feel like that also gives it a very different feeling than the first book.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That in other words, in Brooklyn, the first book, I mean, she's in her early 20s. Anything is possible. She can go to America. She can come home. But in this one, she has got 2 children. She has settled down. And you're dealing with domestic life. The intense interior spaces really are her kitchen, her sitting room, and her bedroom upstairs. The realm of the book is hardly Long Island itself, but it is that house where she has lived her life. And yes, she's... I suppose what I was thinking about also was the idea of feminism. What happened to feminism when it went into places where people weren't reading the famous books, or weren't on marches, or weren't fully conscious of what was happening? That in my own family, in my mother, in her 40s, when my father died, she became acutely conscious of what was happening to women in Ireland. She partly did this one day. There was a newspaper in Ireland called the Irish Press, which is effectively a party political newspaper. And my father was in the party, so we would get the Irish Press. But next door, in a semi-detached houses, were living these Protestants. And they got the Irish Times, which was a Protestant newspaper, becoming a liberal newspaper, becoming a serious newspaper, becoming one of those newspapers that was essential in the sort of way Ireland changed from the 60s onwards. Every day at 7 o'clock in the evening, my job was to get our newspaper, the Irish Press, and go in next door into the Haytons and give it to them. I don't think they wanted it, but we wanted the Irish Times. So I would get their Irish Times, which they had read by that time, and brought into my mother, who would devour it. And so all those ideas about women's rights, about what was happening to women, women in the workplace, women in marriage, women as mothers, came to her via articles by Irish women who had been reading Betty Friedan, who'd been reading Germaine Greer. And so I was thinking about Eilis in the novel, that she's in this suburb, but somehow or other she's become articulate. The big change is not merely that the years have passed, but that she has become, she's got control over her voice. There's a lot of dialogue in the book, and every time she speaks in full sentences. And that's a deliberate way of suggesting that in some way or other, she has educated herself, or that she has become in control of I suppose, not just her own speech, but her own realm. And so when that is threatened, she can actually manage, almost as a lawyer would, to take apart forensically what other people are saying. And part of this is that one day she realizes that she can get a subscription to the New York Times Sunday edition. So instead of all her family, the Italians are all eating and drinking and having a nice time, and she's at home with her New York Times, learning about the world she lives in. It's a tiny detail in the book, but it's an important moment that she's not merely middle-aged, she's not merely a woman living in a suburb with her children, but she's someone in a process of change, which is, I think, all the more rich because she isn't conscious of the source of that change, but the source of that change is feminism.
Yeah, and when she's granted that opportunity, like, would you want to opt out of the family Sunday meal? She says, yes, absolutely. She would much rather read her newspaper and be in her own room.
Anyone who's ever married into a family knows that lovely feeling of, why don't you all go and talk about it while I can read my book?
Yeah. Well, I mean, on that note, I have to ask you a rather obvious question, which is that somebody who was sitting near me at one of the readings here, mentioned that, I'm so excited about this session, and I've been reading him these novels, but then I looked him up, and he doesn't look like Eilis. How did this man write into this woman's perspective? And I want to ask you that partly because I think there's been a lot of anxiety around this in recent years in literature in general, is who writes what, who has the right to write as whom, and who can project and imagine themselves as other people. And I mean, I just think, you talked about the ideas that were informing you, and about feminism, and about, and I want to know, how you respond to that kind of anxiety that a lot of people these days have, or even maybe that question, which is like, should and could you? And she said, oh, he absolutely did. He absolutely wrote as a woman would feel in the situation. And so I found that, made me sort of think to ask you how you respond to that anxiety or that question, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I think it'd be very difficult for me now. I think for any man now to try and say, oh, I could write a novel about a contemporary young woman and tell you where she would go and what she would do and how she would feel. And my mother had two younger sisters, and they didn't marry until later, so they were in our house a lot. The town was small, they were living in the town. Auntie Harriet came for what we called dinner every day, meaning dinner was at lunchtime. And so she would often come again in the evening. Auntie Maeve, Auntie Kathleen. Auntie Kathleen didn't ever marry, so that she was at one stage. Auntie Kathleen came every evening at some point, just to look in, just to see everything was going. And so I have a sense of, say, it's Sunday when I'm about 5 or 6, and there are my mother, her two sisters, my father's sister, my two nearest siblings who are girls, older ones. And all of them are upstairs, and there could be somebody else. And they're all in my parents' bedroom. And they could be talking about anything. It could be the dullest subject. My Auntie Harriet, there was a green coat she almost bought in Cleary Sale in Dublin, and then she didn't buy. And they would get to me, Harriet, my mother would say, I don't think green suits you. And I'd say, but no, I don't, And then someone else would say, oh, well, she's a lovely green shoes. And I'd say, no. And then could go on for it. I would be absolutely riveted by. There was an undercurrent of something. But often the undercurrent was merely they didn't want to bore each other. And no matter what was coming up, it was absolutely fascinating. And then eventually they would realize that I was listening far too closely, and they would put me out. So, Colm, get out. And say, but out. So I would go downstairs to find that my father and his brother and my brother and some other fellow were sitting downstairs, and the men were smoking, this old-fashioned smoking of. And one of them could say, I mean, I'm not making this up, something like, that second goal last Sunday, I thought it was good. And then my father could say, just like. No, hold on. And then the other man could say, but I thought that young Kinsella nearly scored a great goal the Sunday before. and they'd do this, look. And you think, I know why Samuel Beckett was a social realist, you know, I thought, this is the most boring. And then I think, what am I going to do? Am I going to go upstairs again to try and get in, see if I can just sneak in? Or is there anything to do now? And of course, there is always something to do, which is that the initial business of say, being a novelist is that's not enough. You need to go next door now. I mentioned the neighbours, you know. So you go into the neighbours and you get into their house and you say, Auntie Harriet bought a fur coat in Dublin. It's a complete lie, taken from a fact that Auntie Harriet nearly bought a green coat in Dublin. And that becomes, and the neighbour says, did she? And you say, yeah, she was up for the sales and she saw it, and you suddenly start a whole story about Auntie Harriet in Dublin and the sales. And then a week later, your mother says to you, did you tell Mrs. And you realise that it's that whole impulse, not only to listen closely, see the possibilities, weigh them up, but get out quickly with the story and make up more of it and get a shape on it and go next door. And that actually is the whole business, the whole enterprise. But it depends for me on the idea that you're lying in bed, and it could be a child, and thinking, I wonder if Auntie Harriet went to America, what it would be like for her. So I'm not talking here about women or about a man writing a woman. I'm thinking about someone I knew, someone I saw every day. I know how she spoke. I'm not saying I know how she feels. How does anyone feel? But that idea of in 1951, say, that she was young enough, it was a possibility, women of her age did do this. And I give her in Brooklyn exactly where she worked. I name it, thus to anchor it. So S&A.G. Davis was where my two aunts worked. It was the office of the mill in Enniscorthy. I mean, they used the real notepaper in the film because it's real notepaper. I mean, that's where they worked. And if you worked in the office there, you were automatically a member of the 9-hole golf course. That was part of the deal. It was one of those old patrician firms that did produce flour. It was a flour mill in Enniscorthy, and so really, Brooklyn is just imagining her and her older sister, who was a much more sort of powerful figure, just from the point of view of what if they had done this? So I'm not claiming any knowledge of anything other than I imagined that she went somewhere she didn't go. And I tried to imagine what would have happened to her had she gone there. And in doing that, I was using experiences of my own, because just before I wrote the book, I had spent a semester in Texas. I found Texas odd because it's so far from the sea, and I just had to drive on the wrong side of the road. There was a general Texan way of going on that was new to me. And I felt oddly homesick. And I had no right to feel homesick. I mean, it wasn't as though I was, suffering in any way. But nonetheless, when I came home, I had a sense of that idea of going away, especially to America, and coming back again, and what that was like. So a lot of those things in Brooklyn are sort of personal. But the large question about appropriation remains important. But I just said, for me, it was just entirely small, entirely family, entirely about someone I knew, rather than a larger one.
On the matter of your childhood and kind of growing up in Ireland, your writing career, though, didn't necessarily begin with, correct me if I'm wrong, but you began as a journalist, is that right? I mean, you weren't immediately necessarily from that young of an age starting to turn the stories of your aunts and your community into fiction yet. So can you talk a little bit about starting your writing life as a journalist? And because it does feel like with your novels being so extraordinarily immersively interior, having been a journalist myself, it's an outward-facing field. It's a world. It's trying to document what you're seeing around you, and they feel to me like very different and increasingly more and more. And I'd be curious to ask if you could talk about your early career as a journalist and how that feels different to you, or perhaps how it informed your fiction.
I began as a poet, and I was 12, and I was a poet at 12 without a poem. So I thought I should rectify this by writing some, And I published quite a few poems in a little magazine for teenagers. Unfortunately, there's an archive now. They kept everything I sent and everybody else. And luckily, I haven't been near it. But so that between the ages of 12 and 20, I probably wrote a poem every day. And by 20, I realized I was no good. And I realized I was no good because editors sent poems back, friends told you, like, this is not any good. And Ireland is funny like that because there's so many good poets that if you weren't a good poet, you really should stop. And luckily, I knew that. And at 20, I stopped. And only then did I become a journalist. But I was always aware that I was in the wrong job. And I began my first novel when really working hard on political things. There was a lot of crisis in Ireland in those years, the 1980s, and there were a lot of referenda on things like abortion, divorce. There was a government we didn't like. There was Northern Ireland. There were all those things happening. And you could be right in the middle of it, and at a certain moment, a line of a poem, not a poem I wrote myself, but a line of a good poem could come to you. And you could suddenly, in the middle of a press conference or in the middle of an important moment, feel, I shouldn't be here. I should be somewhere else. I should be somewhere where silence reigns, or where other matters that are more personal, more interior, as you say, are to the fore. And I wondered, if I lose this poetry thing, what will it be then? Will I just be this sort of sad old fellow wandering around Dublin, the guy who nearly became a poet, but he just wasn't good enough? And I thought, well, yeah, maybe I'll just do that, and I'll start drinking heavily or something. And so the novel, the first novel, came almost poetically, almost as a set of images that had resonance, rather than, say, a story about Irish politics or public life in Ireland. It was about very private things, and it was written in a sort of style that was, I was working on sentences. So it went exactly against what I was doing in the day. I would go home in the evening and almost create a pure space for myself away from what I've been doing in the day.
But it's interesting on that. I mean, you did publish a collection of poems recently, Vinegar Hill, and so clearly you are not,
Look, I paid my dues. I went silent for 35 years.
So it's time to reclaim
I just couldn't contain myself,
sure.
Especially during the pandemic, somehow, when all of our dreams came back to us to haunt us.
Right.
And one of mine was the poems. Where are they?
But what you said, though, about going back into sort of the silence and into a room away from all of this public life. But what I liked about something that you said in an interview about writing is that you don't write sort of for self-exploration, and some of this description of the writer can sound a bit like it's someone who's quite self-indulgent or self-involved, but you've said that writing for you is all about communication, that it's really about communicating with somebody else. It isn't so much that because that sort of image of the writer, and we see it in film and we see it in public culture, it's that this person has seceded from public life in a kind of almost monastic way to sort of do something higher. And yet your work is very much something that people are reading, and that is you're, as a reader, not just encountering you're feeling very involved in it. And I find that to be a very special kind of quality in your work.
Yeah, I think you're right about the journalism thing. The journalism is great like that. It gives you a sense, if journalism isn't written for the reader, who's it written for? It's hardly self-exploration to explain to people, to tell people what happened yesterday. And therefore you get a sense that there is a reader. But I think it's also, with a novel, it's the very idea that somehow or other you've had a dream, or you've had a thought, or you've had a sentence, and you want someone else. It's almost like being a singer, where you really are not a singer unless you're singing a song, and the song is to be sung out loud for someone to hear. I think that's a basic idea. But what you've got to be careful with then is, I suppose, it does include various forms of self-suppression. That, in other words, if I'm sending someone to Brooklyn in 1951, then I really can't include things that, I can't start exploring myself in that situation. I suppose the idea is that the page is not a mirror. You're working. You're not looking into it. Narcissus ended badly, and that the page is blank, and that your job is to create rather than self-explore. I think that's true. I think it's true, especially if you're a novelist.
Well, and on that note, what really amazes me about Long Island is right before Long Island, not right before, but a few years earlier, you had published The Magician, which is this very different kind of book. And it's about Thomas Mann, but from that moment, you mentioned the opening and kind of plot. That's not plot only, that's very different. That's that's one of these, like The Master, your novel about Henry James, it's really a novel about the sort of interior life of a writer, the kind of the insecurities and the privacy and the career demands and all these sorts of things, and again, very different kinds of books. But I wanted to ask you, do you see those two novels as part of a similar project, or could you talk about The Magician perhaps? Because Long Island feels maybe it must have been a relief to write something also so different and to switch into such a different music, because that book I find a very different experience, and I still think about it very differently.
Yeah, I'd written, I think, 1999, I wrote a novel called The Blackwater Lightship, and it has 6 characters over 7 days, more or less locked in a house close to the Irish coast in the southeast of Ireland. And it's full of rain outside. Inside it's full of recrimination. There isn't exactly the rosary, but there nearly is. And they're making tea all the time, these Irish people, and they're fighting. There's a grandmother, granddaughter, friend. It seems so enclosed, so claustrophobic, and some of it's so personal. And I thought, I never want to see these people again in my life. I mean, readers can do what they like with this book, but I am shut down on this. And I don't want another drop of rain, mist, bits of wind, the night falling down, and the Irish ready for more recrimination. I thought, is there anything else I can do? And I thought, Henry James, I could go to Venice and research my novel there rather than looking into my own sort of mouldy heart. And so that novel became, in a way, a reply to the previous book, a way of just working in a different way on a writer who had a very glamorous life, had plenty of money, and he traveled a lot. And I just thought it would be a better way of just getting out of the dilemma I'd put myself in, which was to lock myself into this business of dreariness, of an Irish dreariness, which I thought, there's enough dreariness there without a novel adding to the dreariness. And so, I wrote the Master. These 2 novels, The Master and The Magician, one is about Henry James, the other is about Thomas Mann. I don't have a third. These were 2 writers I was obsessed by when I was about 20. And a lot of new information became available about their lives later on. And they are almost, they're fiction. But at the same time, if I say Thomas Mann was in Munich in 1933, then he was. So you have to stick to certain facts and then immerse the reader in the character, in the interior life, in the imagination, so that you're creating illusion all the time in the dialogue, in the way you're describing things. But that's based on a scaffolding, or the scaffolding is there, which is dates, facts, almost numbers, because Thomas Mann had 6 children. It's really difficult in a novel to do 6 children. I mean, no one, name a novel with 6 children. Because you just can't keep them in the air all the time. You forget that Monica, I haven't mentioned Monica for, it's 60 pages since Monica has appeared. I have to do something now with Monica. There's Michael arriving. I wish I could do away with Michael and Monica and just have 4 children. But you can't do that because he had 6, and you have to, even though it's a novel, even though you have license, even though it's fiction, you can't just do away with these children. And so it was a different process, and it was, once you do it, you never want to do it again. I mean, it's almost like sequels. You shouldn't probably write novels about writers. But it was just began as a sort of an exercise, but it took up a lot of emotional energy eventually.
Well, and that's what I found so interesting, is that these 2 books came out quite close to each other, and one does feel like a big kind of period epic, a kind of big screen film, and then the other one is very agile and very gripping, but also about 3 adults in Enniscorthy. On the matter of The Magician, though, when you were working on it and all this extensive research at Thomas Mann's life is when, unfortunately, you were diagnosed with cancer, something that you've written about, and you wrote this brilliant essay, which is in one of the essay collections that's available in the collection that's here, but brilliant in the sense that you wrote this, as you continue writing nonfiction, but you wrote it not in kind of the way I hate to say it, cancer literature tends to become, which is that I battled this thing and I came out on the other side a wiser person. You wrote something that I think a lot of people really connected with. It was unsentimental and it was quite direct, but I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about not only obviously the essay, but also the experience and how you look back on that now.
I mean, the first thing is I promised I am not writing a cancer book. That a book where I battled and, my battle, my struggle. I thought, first of all, I'm probably not going to recover. But secondly, it just wasn't a battle. The nurses were doing battles, the people in the kitchen. The oncologist every so often looked pretty embattled. I just lay there. And lying there then, there's nothing to be said about it. And anyone who's been through chemo knows the levels of anguish you get, the extraordinary things. You can't listen to music. Why not? Because its sound becomes different under chemo, where music sounds like a jumble of confusion. Turn that off. What's that? How come that could happen to you so easily? A month before you're listening to Bach in the morning, it's one of your weekend things to listen to, one of the cantatas. A month later, you are actually, that music sounds like it's really disturbing me. You can't sleep. You can't eat. You see, you have no taste, which means that water could be sulfuric acid. And so coming towards you, so you don't want to drink, you don't want to eat, you can't sleep. Oh, there must be many other things you can't do. The taste of the smell becomes intense. I could smell perfume from so far away, or that funny aftershave men use. And so there were so many new things happening. And in the middle of the whole thing, you're lying there, and then of course the hospital. I spent a lot of time actually in hospital. The nurses, the nurses, you see, were on 12-hour days, 7 days a week. So they do 12-hour days, 7 days a week. And then they're free for a full week. So some of the younger ones would go to Ibiza, go on holidays. They'll come back in on a Monday morning filled with their stories of where they've been. And you get to know the nurses very well, and they get to know you. And the night is long. And I swear not a thought comes into your head. Thought goes. I began to dream about marinades in steak. But I wouldn't know a marinade from toilet duck, I don't cook. And I could... Anyway, it was the most extraordinary time, and I lay there, and there were blood clots. There was every type of problem. And when it was over, I thought, I don't need to write about this. No one needs to know. This is private. And then about 3 months later, I had testicular cancer, which is very unusual because you don't usually get that in your 20s. But there's a window. I love windows. A window is a new thing. The oncologist said there's a window in your early 60s where this can come. For about 2 years, it's open. I thought, great, an open window. And I was walking along, again, this is walking along the street business, and a sentence came into my head. And once the sentence was in my head, I had the piece almost written, just with one sentence. And the sentence is the first sentence of the piece, and it said, it all started with my balls.
That's the first sentence, yeah.
So with my balls, that I actually could write the piece. And so, yeah.
So there's the opening again.
That's the opening sentence.
Yeah.
It all started. My balls over my balls.
I mean, an essay I would recommend to everyone to read. It's
No, don't mind. Don't read. Have a nice
don't
day.
Read it.
Have a nice day.
But I think what's nice is if one is a fan of your writing, there is a lot of different kinds of writing from you to read. And on that note, I just wanted to ask one last question before opening it up to the audience here, is that you also published for this summer, for the centenary of James Baldwin's birth, one of the writers that you most admire. You haven't novelized, but maybe that's another book for another time. But you wrote a book of essays on James Baldwin. And I bring him up because I think one thing about him, why I think a lot of younger people, a lot of people today are reading him all the time, is that he, while being also a fiction writer, was somebody who really confronted the American public life and American public mythology. And I think his work has been feeling very prophetic and very resonant and very urgent to a lot of people. And yet you have an essay in your book of essays about him that describes this tension between public life and the public demands on the writer. You mentioned the 80s in Ireland for you, and the private work of a writer, and I wondered if you would say something about Baldwin and why he was a subject for you for this work of essays, and what perhaps now, because frankly I think all of us, whatever your disposition is, we're about to enter a pretty chaotic period of public life, and I think public discourse and tensions. And I think people are turning to writers and thinking, what are people going to do? And we have had a lot of fiction and literature that has been all about confronting the public question. And I just wonder if you would say something about when you look at Baldwin as a model for a kind of figure who tried to toggle this tension, how he did it, or perhaps, what you see in his legacy.
I think James Baldwin, during the civil rights movement, took the view that legislation would not be enough, that there needed to be a change in the spirit, and that this would have to occur in the private life. This couldn't be something you could do in families or in communities or even in a society, that it would have to happen in each individual life. And he saw it in the end not merely as a crisis of grace, In other words, that people were not behaving gracefully. But he saw it as a crisis of masculinity. He thought the hardest thing to be in America is to be a man in America. Now, part of his reason for this is that he saw the whole business of, say, an Italian, which is something that's in these two novels, Brooklyn and Long Island, but in a hidden sort of way, that if you have a man who's Italian, who comes to America from Naples, his sons become Americans. They speak American. They do American. The father is never fully American. Somehow he becomes like a son to them, or he never becomes a full father to them because his accent will be different. His ways of thinking will be different. The sort of feelings he had coming away from his own country will be different. And that father-son relationship is snarled from the very beginning within the systems of immigration into America. And he saw that as the beginning of a crisis. He saw it as a crisis for African-American men in relation to their fathers having been, for example, so poor or mistreated or ill-treated that the idea that you could have a father who had failed or who seemed to have been ill-treated and you're his son, how does that father-son thing work? So he wrote a lot about that idea of what it meant to be a man in America. And I'd never put a thought into it. Like, the idea of having to put thought into being a man is bad enough, being gay without having to start worrying about everybody else. But I have to, those essays on that now, on that idea, I suppose, of people really worrying about their own masculinity, feeling threatened and feeling estranged, and having then to do something about their own, even in the great privacy, the great private space in America is the ballot box, and where nobody knows what you're going to do. And you can do something very surprising, but that some element in you could emerge that is under threat or less than rational, as well as being perhaps entirely self-interested. But that, this is a very complex business as to how voting is done in any country. But I think just now, when we're looking for motives, we're looking for how certain things happen, how polling is done, how we interpret elections, that those Baldwin essays on what it means to be a man in America were a big surprise to me when I read them. I hadn't thought about it before. I haven't read anything as good as them. So it's a 1,000-page book called The Essays of James Baldwin. It's published by the Library of America, but they're also published in little volumes. But it's not merely about the African-American experience, because he says there's no black problem in America. We don't have a problem. You have a problem. There's a white problem in America. And so he begins with that idea. Don't tell us we're the problem. How would we be the problem? You're the problem. We're a problem for you. We're not a problem for ourselves. And so he starts with an idea like that, which is pretty simple, and moves into much more complex areas to do with what it feels like to be less than a man in a society where masculinity, there's so many images of strength around masculinity. I have to say they were new to me, and I wanted to explore all that in the book I wrote about Baldwin. And I think it's particularly important just now.
Thank you. We have some time for questions, and there's a mic, so if somebody has a question, I'll call on you. We can make sure there's a mic. There's a question up here on the right.
Thank you both for being here. Really appreciate it. You both have mentioned a few times that novels really shouldn't have sequels. That being said, when might we expect to see Manhattan or the Bronx or Queens? Because it seems like these
Upstate,
characters
maybe.
certainly have more journeys to take.
Oh, I don't have a clue. If you had any ideas, maybe you could write them down for me. And I'll see if I could dramatize them, but I can't see it at the moment. But I couldn't see it with Brooklyn. And the problem is that time is moving on. There were 14 years between Brooklyn and Long Island. So I'm 69. And I mean, 83 is good. I'm sure at 83 I'll be doing something. But it's hard. Look, I'll give you the name of an old people's home in Ireland. And you can knock the door and say, is there any chance he's writing anything? And I'll be 83 and I'll probably be sitting happily watching the daytime TV. I don't have a clue at the moment. I really don't. Sorry.
Is there a question on the side? Yeah, right here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. How influential was your childhood stammer and the untimely passing of your dad in your later writings? Thank you.
This is my father had a stroke and he needed a huge brain operation when I was 8, and so my parents were away for a very long time while all that was happening, and I was staying with an aunt, and. When I came back to school, I developed a stammer, and I'd never connected the two things. You know, I didn't, like, why do you get a stammer at a certain age and not another? But I can work it out because I know what class I was in, and I know what year it was then. And it's an absolute nightmare because, especially if you're me, and I can't really still say my own name. Cold. If someone says, what's your name? The hard C and the T just get me. So I could do everything possible. I could go, my name is, but if I call it, it really is. And so you work your way around it. You've developed softer ways of starting sentences. I could even do a reading from this book now, probably without making why am I saying making a mistake? I mean stammering. I could probably do it, but if I was tired, if I was under pressure, you could suddenly see it, and once it starts, it's really hard to manage. So that started that year, and it stayed. And I would presume it's very hard for me to write a novel in which there would be a father and a mother and their children. The image of that I don't have. And so here, if you just look, I mean, I know that Tony has a father in the book, but he's not, like, in other words, Eilis's father is just not there in Brooklyn or here. And this goes through all the books. Thomas Mann's father, part of the attraction of Thomas Mann was that his father dies when he's a teenager. I can write that. If he stayed alive, and I wouldn't be sure how that would work. So obviously, you work as a novelist in ways you don't understand out of levels of your own experience that are perhaps undercurrents. And then you learn after 5 books. I mean, a woman in Australia said to me, she was getting a book signed, and she seemed very nice, and she said, how many people die in this one? And I've never been asked that before. I had to say to her, quite a few, darling. I mean, I don't know what to say. But this novel, Long Island, is the first novel I've written out of 11 in which nobody dies. So I feel something must have happened.
I also want to make sure if there's somebody who has a question up above that we haven't missed it. No? Okay. Is this another question? Okay. And this same row. Sorry. Okay.
So glad to hear from your background, but I'm interested, we're here with some people who are actually working on some books, and we're interested in finding out how you approach it. Do you start with an outline? Do you just kind of, are you a pantser? What's your day look like when you're actually sitting down to take a go on your journey?
I think that you must let the thing sleep, you know, and see what happens. So if you have an idea or something or an image, you needn't do anything with it. And don't take notes. I don't take notes. I feel notes are for something you're going to forget. I don't want to write an outline because I don't want to write anything except the first sentence of the book. So when that will come, it might come naturally. So again, just you're home. You've had a nice, good espresso coffee in the morning, or music, or something comes to you, some emotion that it seems raw and fresh, and suddenly you realize, no, it's not an emotion raw and fresh. It's, I'm going to go and write this. And that's in feeling, I think songwriters really know it, where suddenly you have the melody is coming in on the wind, and you write it, and what you need to do when you've written it is to start working. Don't wait again. You have it now. And start working. And for me, I can do a lot of work very, very quickly in the middle of a book. So just if I need to, if I can take a month or even 3 weeks, I can do the middle part of a book in that time. If I have written, if I've written 60 pages, I can write 150 in 3 weeks or 4 weeks. Now, I'll revise those revising words, taking out sentences. I won't rewrite. And then I'll take my time with the end. But there's an intense period in which I can really work. But everyone's different.
I think there's a question in the back here. Yeah, please.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon. It's been really lovely listening to you. You mentioned feminism, and I was curious, you mentioned feminism and you talked about how when you write about women, you're really thinking about the women that you know. Recently I read The Testament of Mary, and I would love to hear more about that woman, specifically why you picked her, since she's a pretty prolific woman that none of us, at least in this room, have personally gotten to know. Thank you.
I wrote a novel and I wrote a play called The Testament of Mary, in which Mary, the mother of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, gets to speak. First person, voice. I'd say it wasn't my Auntie Harriet. You know, in other words, you're absolutely right. I can't tell you, oh yes, well, she was around the house a lot. She didn't marry until later, and it was a similar matter that I was starting to pay real attention to the Greek plays with a view to doing versions of things, and so Medea, Electra, Antigone, those figures, and I was at a party in Dublin, and I suddenly said to someone out of the blue, it's odd thinking how many lost plays there are in the Greek canon. This is what you talk about in Dublin coming up to Christmas. And what's really odd, even stranger, is that there is one Greek play we have, but we don't recognize we have, which is the New Testament. That if you think about the story of Mary, the mother, the mourning mother of Jesus, as a Greek play. And then I discovered that St. John, who wrote, in my view, the best of the four Gospels, although I don't think, they're all divinely inspired, but that he saw Greek theatre when he was in Ephesus. And so I went to Ephesus. And I hung around Ephesus just looking at all the places St. John had been, St. Paul had been. It was viewed that Mary, the mother of Jesus, had been taken to Ephesus by St. John to protect her. But none of this is clear, except it is clear that St. John was in Ephesus and St. Paul was in Ephesus. So I began to study, especially just the number of beautiful Greek theatres and Greek temples in that space. And one night in Ephesus, it was the winter, there was no one else in the hotel. And so, the waiters are delighted you're there, but they really want you to finish your dinner early so they can go home. And you end up in your room. This is it. This is in Turkey. And it's 7 o'clock in the evening. Nothing more is going to move. There's nothing on television except things in Turkish. And so I started to write, imagining that as an old woman with nothing to lose, being protected by these men, and realizes that they're writing down the story, what happened. But she can't write. She can't read. She begins to speak. And she would only do it once, to say what happened from her side. And so I did that. I wrote it pretty quickly and didn't know what to do with it. And eventually it was, Meryl Streep did the audiobook. And it was on the theatre, and it came out as a book. But again, there's no possibility of a sequel to it. Except the whole story of Christianity ever since. But so it was a once-off, and it was almost a fluke, and that's the Testament of Mary.
We have time for one last question. Is there anybody above who maybe had a question? I can't see, or maybe down here. I guess, sir, why don't you? I think I can. This question here.
From listening to you, one of my complaints may be answered, but I was troubled that the men were not so good. Can you comment on that? They weren't strong. They weren't real leaders.
Yeah. I do have a novel called The Heather Blazing, which is the story of an Irish judge, more or less from his perspective. But yeah, I think in these books, Eilis dominates these books, and it is as though the figures around her are that she is. So I'm going to get this metaphor wrong about satellites, but that she's at the very center, and that certainly we don't. Tony doesn't start to read. Her husband doesn't start to read the New York Times. That it is, that she's on her own with that. Yeah, I think that's true in those two books. I think it's true in the novel Nora Webster because it's about a widow whose husband is dead. And it's very much based on what happened at home in our house after my father died. And so it really is a portrait of my mother. And even with Thomas Mann and Henry James, you don't feel about them that they're Napoleon, that they're about to sort of, invade Russia.
But do you see them as weak men?
I do.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. And I'm interested in that. I'm interested in what that looks like. I find it very difficult to write about an alpha male. I don't know what he would think or do, but it wouldn't be. You could dramatize it, but it'd be about like dramatizing Gladiator 9 or something. It's just not for me. I mean, I'm sure there are,
Gladiator's coming out
figures
soon.
like Saul Bellow, could write
Yeah.
these great men who were fully, but oh God, no. And, you're absolutely right. I mean, really, yeah. I mean, it's like, how could you leave half the human race out of your novels? But maybe I'll do something to rectify that.
Well, we're very lucky to have you here, and you're going to sign
Thank you very much. Thank you.
as well.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Charleston Literary Festival, my name is Sarah Moriarty, I'm the Executive Director. I just want to formally thank Bilal Qureshi for that wonderful facilitation. I want to thank Vice Consul to the Irish Vice Consul of Ireland to the Southeast, Nicole Shields. I also want to tell you all that Colm Tóibín will be signing books after the session. So you can buy the books from our bookstore, Buxton Books, and he'll be available in the pop-up bookstore at the back of the theatre where you can meet with him and he will sign your books. And I just want to say, Colm Tóibín, what an absolute honour to have you here with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
One more time, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.